I recently took a drive through Marshalltown, Iowa, a place you really wouldn't expect to find on the front lines of a global shift.
Marshalltown, right in the heart of the Midwest.
Exactly. And in the shadow of this grand old 19th century courthouse, the air, it used to be just thick with the smells of, Vietnamese pho and Mexican carnitas.
So a real vibrant, multicultural community.
It really was. On Sundays, the pews at St. Mary's Catholic Church were so packed, you'd have to squeeze in just to hear the Spanish liturgy. It felt like a town that had actually, figured something out.
How to stay young while the rest of the region was getting older.
That's it, exactly. How to stay young and vibrant while the rest of the Midwest grew old and quiet. But this time, the streets felt thinner.
Thinner, that's an interesting word for it.
I spoke with a local leader there, and he looked more puzzled than angry, really. He told me about a construction site for a new high school stadium that just suddenly went silent. The foreman, the guy who knew where every single bolt and beam belonged, he received a deportation letter and just vanished.
Just gone. And the whole project grinds to a halt.
Completely. And then you hear these other stories like this legendary Venezuelan orchestra in South Florida. They've played a holiday concert for generations.
Okay.
This year, they canceled it. Not because they didn't have the music. It was because the audience and, half the musicians were too terrified to even leave their houses.
That's a powerful image, the silence on the construction site, the canceled concert.
Right. And the argument we've all been hearing is so straightforward. Close the doors, tighten the locks, and America returns to its, quote, uncontested global prime, a more orderly nation.
That's the theory, anyway.
But then you're standing in a West Virginia hospital wing that's dark because the overseas doctors never arrived. Or you're looking at a Pennsylvania dairy farm where the owner is desperately placing ads that no one answers. You start to see a very different reality.
It moves from a political slogan to a tangible economic reality. It's one thing to talk about zero immigration as a campaign slogan. Another thing to watch the literal heartbeat of a community begin to slow down. We're in the middle of this massive, high-stakes experiment.
And that's exactly what our deep dive is designed to investigate today. We need to move past the rhetoric and really analyze this experiment using hard data.
Right.
We have economic models, deep historical parallels, statistical analyses. Our mission is to look for the measurable consequences on the big drivers, labor, inflation, innovation, and check the stability of critical sectors, healthcare, construction.
So the core question is, does closing the doors lead to this uncontested global prime? Or does it lead to something else entirely?
Exactly. Does it lead to a dangerous, self-imposed economic and social deceleration? That's what we need to figure out. Can the modern U.S. economy actually absorb the shock of a self-imposed labor drought?
Okay, let's start right there with the most immediate economic pain points. You mentioned construction, so let's dig into that. I heard this story about a guy named Marcus, a general contractor in a booming part of North Carolina. Marcus's situation is a perfect microcosm of this economic chokehold we're seeing.
He's been building homes for 3 decades. But now, he describes his construction sites as ghostly.
And you have to understand the bigger picture here. Demand for housing is through the roof, right? You have population growth, new households forming, inventory is low everywhere.
So developers have the money, the land, the permits, everything's ready to go.
Everything except the people. The supply chain for labor has been severed. Marcus had to halt a mid-sized housing project.
Why? What was the specific bottleneck?
His specialized team of finish carpenters. These are the high-skilled guys who do the cabinetry, the trim, the final details that make a house a home. They'd been in the visa pipeline for years.
And then what happened?
Suddenly, their final approval gets blocked, new fee hikes, a mountain of new red tape, and boom, they're forced out of the pipeline completely.
So now he's got a half-finished subdivision on his hands, a contract he can't fulfill, and the key people who can finish the job are just gone.
Right. And the immediate, unavoidable economic consequence of that is a double whammy.
Okay, what's the first hit?
Stalled productivity. The work just stops. But the second hit is inflation. When that specialized labor supply vanishes, the demand for the few remaining workers skyrockets.
So Marcus is now in a bidding war for a handful of local carpenters.
That's an aggressive bidding war. He's paying maybe 20-30% more than he projected for those trades, and he's not going to just eat that cost.
Of course not. It gets passed on to the home buyer.
Every single time, it gets baked directly into the cost of housing. That's wage push inflation in its purest form.
So the goal of protecting local jobs ends up stalling an entire industry and making housing more expensive for everyone.
That is precisely it. You create what we call a productivity desert. You have capital, you have demand, but you just don't have the human hands to turn inputs into finished outputs. And this is all happening against a much bigger structural problem.
The aging of the U.S. workforce.
The relentless pressure of an aging population. The baby boomers are retiring in droves, and that's been shrinking the domestic labor pool for years. The system was already under stress.
But didn't we see that trend reverse a bit in 2022 and 2023? It felt like the labor market was surprisingly strong.
It was, and what often gets missed in this whole debate is the crucial role that migration played in that. We saw a really robust rebound in labor supply, and it was estimated to be driven largely by higher net migration.
So new arrivals were filling a critical gap.
A huge gap. This influx happened exactly when the labor market was tightest and vacancies were everywhere. So these new foreign-born workers could be matched with jobs relatively quickly. This increase in labor availability is widely credited, even by economists at the Federal Reserve, with helping to cool down inflationary pressures.
It was like a pressure release valve.
A very necessary one. It kept wages from spiraling out of control. So migration wasn't just filling jobs, it was a key component of macroeconomic stability.
And then, in 2024, the policy changes hit, and enforcement tightened.
And you see the effect immediately. It's a rapid, measurable response. Crossings at the southern border halved in the second half of the year compared to the first, and the economic data tracks with that slowdown almost perfectly.
Give me the hard numbers on that.
Okay, so the foreign-born labor force, after growing at a really strong 5.2% rate in 2023, suddenly shrank by 0.8% in the second half of 2024.
0.8% doesn't sound like a lot, but what does that mean in terms of actual people?
It translates to a loss of approximately 45,000 migrant workers per month between June and December of 2024.
45,000 workers a month. Wow. Can the U.S. labor market just absorb that kind of shock?
No, it can't. And the evidence is right there in the jobs reports. That loss of 45,000 workers a month corresponds almost exactly to the slowdown in jobs growth we saw in the non-farm payrolls report. It decelerated by an average of 50,000 jobs per month over that same period.
So the correlation is basically 1-to-1.
It's incredibly tight. And this isn't just about new arrivals being stopped. A big part of it is something called the chilling effect.
Okay, define that for us.
The chilling effect is when migrants who are already in the country, maybe they're undocumented, maybe they're on some kind of precarious temporary status, they just opt out of the formal labor force.
Because they're afraid of being deported.
Exactly. The perceived risk goes way up, so they stop looking for formal jobs. They might go underground, or they might just stop working altogether. So you're losing existing workers at the same time you're cutting off the supply of new ones.
It's a double hit to the labor supply. And looking forward, if some of the proposed policies are actually implemented, what's the total potential impact?
When we quantify the potential future reduction, we're talking about removing approximately 2.1 million workers from the labor supply.
2.1 million. That just sounds catastrophic. What is that as a percentage of the entire workforce?
The total civilian labor force at the end of 2024 was about 169 million people. So 2.1 million workers is a loss of almost 1.3% of the total labor supply.
1.3%. A sudden drop of that size. The economy just can't absorb that without massive disruption, can it?
It can't. And we can break down where that number comes from.
Please do. Who are these workers?
Well, first, you have about 615,000 workers who currently have existing deportation orders. You apply a realistic labor force participation rate to that group, and that's your first chunk.
Okay. And the second part?
The second part is, in some ways, even more disruptive. It's the potential cancellation of various temporary protected statuses.
So you're talking about programs like TPS and DACA?
Exactly. TPS for people from Haiti, Cuba, Venezuela, Ukraine, DACA recipients, humanitarian paroles. This group represents about 1.5 million workers.
And these are people who are already working legally.
That's the critical distinction. They are fully integrated, formal economy participants. They're paying taxes. They're part of our communities. Losing 1.5 million legally working, established individuals would create a far more acute shockwave than losing the other group.
And this 2.1 million figure doesn't even account for the slowdown in legal immigration channels like H-1Bs or green cards.
That's absolutely right. The 2.1 million is the shockwave. The slowdown in legal immigration is the long structural decline that follows, and a sustained reduction of this size just creates severe upward wage pressure.
We're back to Marcus the contractor, but now it's happening economy-wide.
Exactly. Employers are forced to pay way more for a dwindling pool of workers, and they pass those costs on to consumers. That is the definition of wage push inflation.
So we're creating an inflation problem that's not about too much demand, but about a policy-driven scarcity of supply. What does that do to the Federal Reserve?
It puts them in an impossible position. They have fought tooth and nail to get inflation down towards their 2% target. They finally feel like they're making progress.
And now this throws a huge wrench in the works.
A massive one. The prospect of this dwindling labor supply feeding persistent structural inflation could force the Fed to adjust policy, and fast. It would mean an early end to any rate cuts. Worst case scenario. They might even have to think about raising rates again.
And that has huge implications for financial markets.
It hits the markets directly. If the Fed can't cut rates, you'll see higher yields, especially at the long end of the curve. Your 30-year mortgages, infrastructure bonds, the cost of all long-term borrowing goes up.
And you mentioned there are specific financial tools that investors use to hedge against exactly this kind of risk.
To be yes, right.
Yes, Treasury inflation-protected securities. They become a very attractive hedge in this scenario. If you look at the market signals, the 10-year U.S. inflation break-evens were at 2.45% in mid-February 2025.
Explain what that means for people who don't follow the bond market.
Sure. A TPS is a Treasury bond where the principal value actually goes up with inflation. That 2.45% break-in rate is the market's prediction for average inflation over the next decade. The fact that it's already well above the Fed's 2% target tells you that investors are already pricing in this risk. They're betting on structurally higher inflation.
It's a direct financial reflection of this policy risk we're talking about. It is. So you can draw a straight line from Marcus the Contractor's ghostly job site to the behavior of the most sophisticated financial institutions in the world. But to really grasp the long-term cost, we have to look back in time.
To the 1920s.
To the 1920s immigration quotas. It's a chilling historical precedent because it's a clear, measurable case study of what happens when the U.S. just abruptly slams the door shut. We're talking about the 1921 Emergency Quota Act and especially the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act.
And what was the stated goal of those acts? It wasn't purely economic, was it?
Not at all. The objective was explicitly cultural and racial. The quotas were designed to severely cut immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, the ESE countries, while preserving what was called a Nordic national character.
So they favored immigrants from Northern and Western Europe.
Exactly. The law enshrined ethnic bias into federal policy, and it just abruptly ended that whole era of unrestricted immigration.
And the effect on the numbers was immediate.
It was a complete collapse. Before the quotas, you had about 4.5 million immigrants arrive between 1910 and 1914. After, between 1925 and 1929, less than 800,000.
Wow.
Net migration plummeted, and the foreign-born share of the population hit a historic low of just 4.7% by 1970. It was a voluntary, intentional lockdown that lasted for decades.
And what did that do to the flow of high-skilled talent, scientists, innovators?
The effects there were profound and, importantly, quantifiable. We've seen research that hand-collected arrival data, and it shows a striking decline in scientists from those ESE countries. Before the quotas, about 18 per year. After, it was cut in half to only 9 per year.
A 50% reduction.
Yeah.
And how did that compare to the groups that were favored by the quotas?
That's the crucial part. Arrivals from Northern and Western Europe, the WNE countries, they actually increased by 22% in the same period. It shows the policy was the direct cause. By the 1950s, studies estimate that 1,170 ESE-born scientists were simply missing from the U.S. scientific workforce.
1,170 missing scientists. That's hard to even wrap your head around.
Well, think of it this way. It's equivalent to losing a major university physics or chemical engineering department, about 38 highly skilled scientists every single year for 30 years.
That's a staggering amount of lost human capital. And it sounds like a direct historical parallel to stories we hear today, like the one about Dr. Lin.
Dr. Lin's story is the modern-day version of those 11,170 missing scientists. She's a biomedical engineer, was working on a breakthrough in non-invasive surgical tools at a top U.S. university.
And her visa renewal was denied.
Denied, just caught up in the delays and the bureaucracy. But she didn't stop her work. She just moved her entire research operation, her lab, her team, her knowledge, to a tech hub in Toronto.
So a pending patent that could have revolutionized American healthcare technology just walked out the door.
It walked out the door and went to Canada. That is how you export intellectual property in real time.
So looking back at the 1920s, what was the bottom line finding on the rate of U.S. invention after those ESE scientists were blocked?
The bottom line is staggering. The quotas led to a measurable 68% decline in U.S. invention in the specific research fields that those ESE scientists had previously dominated.
68%.
And this wasn't a temporary dip. The damage persisted for decades, right through World War II and into the 1960s. We effectively sterilized a huge portion of our own scientific landscape for almost 2 generations.
How did that decline actually show up in the data? Was it just fewer patents overall?
It was structural. On what we call the extensive margin, 16% more of those ESE-dominated fields had no patents filed at all. Entire avenues of research just stopped.
The lights just went out in those fields.
They did. And on the intensive margin, in the fields that did continue, there were 45% fewer patents per field. The number of active scientists working in those areas dropped by 40%. It's a systemic shock.
But what about the counter-argument? That restricting competition might have helped American-born scientists. Did they step up to fill that gap?
That is the absolute key question. And the data gives a very uncomfortable answer. U.S.-born scientists also produced 62% fewer inventions in those same fields.
62% fewer. So the loss of collaboration and knowledge sharing just completely dwarfed any potential benefit from less competition.
By a massive degree. It shows that innovation isn't a zero-sum game. You can't just remove brilliant minds from a network and expect the network to keep functioning at the same level.
Is there a classic example of that network effect breaking down?
The perfect example is the Hungarian mathematician Paul Erdős. He was this legendary collaborator who worked with hundreds of scientists. But he was denied re-entry to the U.S. in 1954 during the Cold War.
And when he was cut off from the U.S. academic system,
his network of U.S. co-authors just collapsed. The number of his new collaborators who were based in the U.S. dropped from 62% of his total to just 24%. Think of all the papers and theories that were never written because of that.
We just inadvertently exported our own intellectual capacity.
We did. And it wasn't just in academia. Firms that employed ESE immigrants in 1921 created 53% fewer inventions after the quotas. And beyond the economics, these same policies prevented refugees, many of them Jewish, from fleeing Nazi brutality in the 1930s.
So we turned away some of the greatest minds of the century?
An immense loss. People who then went on to build the scientific backbone of other nations, nations that welcomed them.
Okay, let's shift to the unskilled labor market in the 1920s. What happened to productivity and wages for the average factory worker?
The outcomes there were really complex. In the urban areas most affected by the quotas, labor productivity growth in manufacturing actually declined by about 1 percentage point per year.
Productivity went down. Why would that happen?
It suggests that native workers and immigrant workers were complements, not substitutes. When you removed that immigrant labor, the whole system became less efficient. It disrupted what economists call agglomeration externalities.
Which is basically the idea that concentrating talent and firms in one place makes everyone more productive.
That's a great way to put it. You remove a key piece of that system, in this case the immigrant labor pool, and the whole thing slows down.
So what about wages? Did the policy at least succeed in raising wages for domestic workers?
It was a very mixed bag. Native white workers, especially in lower wage jobs, actually saw their earnings go down by about 1.4%.
Their wages went down. How is that possible?
It suggests they were complements to the immigrant labor. The native white workers were often supervisors or skilled tradesmen whose jobs were made more productive by having a large pool of immigrant labor in supporting roles. When that support vanished, their own productivity and earning potential dropped.
Unbelievable. So barring the immigrants actually hurt the very people the policy was supposed to help.
For that group, yes. But the picture changes when you look at the black labor force. Black workers in their same areas saw their earnings increase by about 1%.
Why the difference?
It suggests that black workers were more often substitutes for the unskilled European immigrants. They were able to step into some of those vacant factory jobs, which contributed to black-white income convergence in those areas at the time.
That's a fascinating historical split. But the labor landscape is so different today, isn't it? We have that structural aging you mentioned.
It's a completely different ballgame. In the 1920s, you still had a massive youthful domestic labor pool. Today, we're in a state of absolute labor scarcity. There simply aren't enough domestic workers of any background to fill 2.1 million jobs. The outcome today is much more likely to be system-wide capacity constraints and inflation.
And the impact back then wasn't just economic, it was social too.
It absolutely was. The quotas also led to a decrease in marriage rates and lower fertility among first- and second-generation immigrant women. You disrupt a community's ability to form families and build stability, and the effects ripple for generations.
That feels like the perfect bridge to our current situation, especially in one sector that is existentially dependent on foreign-born labor, healthcare.
It is. The U.S. healthcare system is under unprecedented strain. We have a rapidly aging population, and we're facing a projected shortfall of up to 86,000 physicians by 2036. The role of immigrants in this sector isn't marginal, it is absolutely foundational.
How deep does that reliance run?
It's comprehensive. Immigrants are 18% of the total healthcare workforce. But look at the specific roles. They make up a staggering 27% of all physicians and surgeons.
More than 1 in 4 doctors is foreign-born.
Exactly. They're also 16% of registered nurses and 22% of nursing assistants. And that's not even counting the essential support roles.
Right, the people who keep the hospitals running.
Foreign-born workers are 29% of the janitorial and maintenance staff. In a place like New York City, they are a flat-out majority, 57% of the entire healthcare workforce. Without them, the system just stops.
So when you cut off that supply, the effect must be immediate.
It shows up as crippling administrative bottlenecks. As of mid-June 2025, there were nearly 1,000 international doctors who had successfully matched with U.S. residency programs, but were still stuck in visa limbo.
1,000 fully trained doctors, ready to work, just blocked by paperwork.
And employers are screaming for this talent. Job listings offering visa sponsorship have surged by 285% since before the pandemic. And nearly 75% of those sponsorship jobs are in healthcare.
75%. That's a clear signal of desperation.
It is. The industry sees international talent as the only solution to its structural deficit.
Let's bring this back to the human cost we started with. The dark hospital wings in West Virginia.
West Virginia is a textbook example of a fragile system near collapse. The state has nearly a fifth of its nursing posts vacant and already relies on foreign-educated doctors for 1/3 of its physician supply.
And now that supply is at risk.
It is. The visa uncertainty is forcing critical specialists to leave. We saw 2 experienced cardiologists choose to leave for other countries rather than deal with the uncertainty here.
And losing 2 cardiologists in a rural state. That's a catastrophic loss.
It's unrecoverable. It means longer waits, worse outcomes, and higher mortality rates in vulnerable communities. The cost of these policies shows up in delayed appointments and preventable hospitalizations.
And that damage becomes irreversible almost immediately. You can't just replace a specialist overnight.
You can't. And this leads us directly to the next demographic crisis, sustaining our aging population.
The numbers are staggering. By 2034, people over 65 will outnumber people under 18. And the demand for home health aides is projected to grow by 25%.
This is the critical convergence point. The vast majority of the elderly want to age in place in their own homes, but that requires an affordable, robust supply of labor for caregiving, housekeeping, and home modifications.
And that labor is disproportionately foreign-born.
The data is incredibly clear on this. A strong supply of less educated foreign-born labor is directly linked to a lower rate of institutionalization for the U.S.-born elderly.
So more immigrant labor means fewer seniors in nursing homes.
Exactly. A 10 percentage point increase in this labor supply reduces the probability of an elderly person going into a nursing home by 1.5 percentage points. For those over 80, it's a reduction of 3.8 percentage points.
So this labor force isn't just filling jobs, it's providing an infrastructure that fundamentally changes how we deliver elder care. It keeps people at home and keeps costs down.
That's right. But the immediate cost of these new policies is the human devastation we're seeing. Think about that CEO in Boca Raton, Florida. She had to dismiss 38 employees, 9% of her staff, from Cuba, Haiti, and Venezuela when their status was terminated.
She called it a funeral that never ends.
It perfectly captures the loss of stability. And this isn't just a big city problem. It threatens the revitalization we've seen in rural communities.
Which brings us back full circle to places like Marshalltown, Iowa.
Or Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. That area is statistically growing only because of immigration. People whose parents arrived as refugees are now managers and city council members. They literally sustained the community's tax base.
And now those success stories are at risk of being reversed.
Precisely. These revitalized communities face demographic implosion as temporary work permits expire for workers from Haiti, Cuba, and Ukraine. They're left in this terrible limbo, unable to work here, but often unable to safely return home either.
So they're caught in a complete trap.
It's an economic and a human trap. And this is the ultimate risk. We're dismantling the very communities that found a successful model for staying young and vital.
So this whole deep dive really reveals a systemic fragility across key sectors, all immediately impacted by restricting labor.
Absolutely. The data shows the decision is instantly reflected in wage push inflation in construction. And historically, we've seen it inflict a multi-decade stagnation on American scientific innovation. That 68% decline in patent filings is a hard number.
And today, that self-inflicted wound is hitting our most essential areas. A healthcare system that depends on foreign-born workers for over a quarter of its doctors, and an elder care system where that labor literally allows our seniors to age with dignity at home.
When you connect the dots between that history and our modern crisis of care, you realize the greatest long-term cost might not be in the immediate economics. It's in the permanent loss of global talent. Whether it's the scientist moving her lab to Toronto or the valued nursing assistant in rural Iowa, that talent is diverted elsewhere. The lesson from the 1920s is that we inadvertently exported our own scientific breakthroughs for decades. The result of this current experiment risks doing the same, tarnishing the American brand as the world's destination for opportunity and transferring the global engine of innovation and care to other nations who are ready to welcome the talent we turn away.